introduce the panelists in a second. In the meantime, let me tell people who are listening that we do have a translation, interpretation in French and Spanish, but there is the need to unload an application. The application name is All You Say, and you will see that in the chat. And the code is GWL, and the PIN is 2021. All of that you can see in the chat should you wish to have interpretation. So with that said, let me again welcome our panelists today. We, the group of women leaders, Voices for Change and Inclusion, have worked very, very hard to establish this intergenerational dialogue. You have listened to my colleague, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, describe why is it that we reach out to the younger generation to work with young women in this intergenerational dialogue. We are 54 women leaders that have worked in the multilateral system, in the United Nations, in governments, who deeply believe in the need for gender equality and to advance the gender agenda. But we also believe that we represent a view of people of a certain age. Wise people, I will say, not old people. So in that regard, we strongly believe that it's critical to listen to the voices of the young generation to see what is needed to adjust the Beijing agenda and to make it absolutely meaningful to what they see as their future in this world of ours where we intend to have gender equality. So that's why we are here today as part of that network of universities that we have created. We have today 4 students from 4 universities that will be given their perspectives and very likely the perspectives of their fellow students who have worked very closely with them. Who do we have with us today? Well, we have Samantha Nyakundi. She's a student of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs, the school where I am dean of. So it's a pleasure to have you, Sam, with us. She's studying a degree in international affairs, and she's the Director General for IEU and MUN organization. She's also an intern at the African Middle Eastern Leadership Institute, an organization committed to empowering activists from the Middle East and Africa to advance human rights for all human beings. She has held different positions. Samantha has a broad experience with her young age. So welcome, Samantha. We also have Buyiswa Mankavela, a master student at the University of Cape Town. She's specializing in economic development. In addition to her studies, Buyiswa is a research fellow at UCT Mandela School, working as part-time and at AFTA and Transformative Industrialization Project team. Her research interests include the link between industrial and trade policy, social and economic upgrading in the global and regional value chains. Very, very important issues to empower women too. We also have Yaoxian Lu. She's an undergraduate student from China, majoring in translation and interpretation and foreign affairs. In 2020, she participated in the Asian Women's Leadership Program, which made her grow interested in women's leadership and the great importance of women's empowerment. So welcome, Xiaoxian. And we also have Seo-Yeon Kim. She's an undergraduate at Kyunji University of Korea, majoring in political science and international relations, hoping to serve as a diplomat in the foreign services of the Republic of Korea. Her experiences are mainly concentrated on being a delegate and representative of a model multilateral conference, specializing in the Universal Periodic Review and the Treaty and Non-Proliferation of Legal Weapons, and the COP, the Conference of the Parties of UNFCCC, different models of the multilateral system, she's now really interested in seeing how she can contribute to fighting for the advancement of women's rights. So with this being said, welcome, ladies. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. And I think we just can start straight um, going into the subject matter. And the subject matter is precisely how do we contribute to the Generation Equality Forum, which is going to take place in a couple of days in Paris. And the intention of the Generation Equality Forum and our contribution as a GWL and your contribution as part of the intergenerational dialogue is to think how to pursue the gender agenda, which somehow has stalled in the last few years. We all know that with the speed we have today to achieve parity, full parity in our world, will take more than 100 years. We all know that there are only a few women leaders at the helm of governments. We all know that the percentage of representation in parliaments throughout the world, in the judiciary system throughout the world at leadership positions is very, very low. So how do we really push to have this agenda at a different speed of delivery? And we want to provide this platform to you to give your impressions and to allow for you to provide the ones who are going to take decisions with the perspective of the younger generation. So let's talk about the issues at hand. And I will start first with a round of questions. The same question will go to the four of you. You'll have around 3 minutes to respond. And my first question to you is, what is your point of view defining the leadership paradigm? How can we think about leadership differently, again, through the lens of gender equality and gender parity? And Sam, let me start with you.
Thank you, Ms. Malcorra, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm happy to be on this panel with other incredible women who are like-minded. And I'm looking forward to what this discussion will bring. So to begin with the first question, I think the current discourse around leadership still remains largely limited for different reasons. And I think in many ways, it feels like the world is shifting and developing and moving towards a more open, a more inclusive narrative of what leadership should look like, what it should encompass. And with that paradigm, there continues to remain limited by various, a synthesis of different institutional, historical, social, and policy-related limitations and barriers that continue to silence women's voices, especially women who are involved in leadership positions. And so we desperately need not only answers, but new ways of thinking about framing and analyzing the question of leadership. And we need to start asking questions such as, what does it mean to reimagine leadership beyond the long-standing, conventional, myopic, traditional confines of leadership that have long existed and continue to impact the way leadership is constructed and discussed today? And so we're forced to think more critically about our immediate or subconscious thoughts when you think about women who exercise power. When you're posed with the question of who a leader is or what leader you look up to, is your immediate instinct a man who holds this position, or do you find difficulty in identifying a woman who is also in this position? And so I think the way we think about leadership, the sociopolitical underpinnings of how leadership is largely defined, that continue to exclude women from power or situate women outside of power, need to be understood before we start to tackle it at a bigger and more structural level. So I know my understanding of leadership began with me challenging it at an individual level and challenging the traditional narratives of leadership that I grew up being taught, grew up internalizing, and asking myself questions like, what is my template of who a powerful leader is? And how is this template at a dissonance or at a variance with the current reality? And so challenging this at an individual level and then thinking about how this can now expand into a bigger and more structural lens.
Thank you, Sam. I really like that you talk about power. This is at the heart of the matter. The reason why things don't move is because we are challenging power and we want to have a share of power. And that's where the problem lies. Xiao Yen, I would like to hear from you now.
Hello, it's very glad to attend this event. And for me, on defining the leadership paradigm, I think nowadays we're more value sharing and collaboration instead of the command or control that we used to think of the leadership. So I think nowadays the leadership are focusing on the collective effects and also the collective gains, the collective efforts, instead of the personal gains and the personal profits. And also, as today we're talking about women's leadership, I think a women's leadership should also be a collaborative one. And also, I think how we define leadership should based on the person's capability, its influence, instead of he or she's his or her gender. So I like to share some more detailed information about women's leadership in the small and medium enterprises, which I researched several days ago. So I think that women are facing a great more challenges, especially in these SMEs. So why we think SMEs are so important because there's a very common around the world. So maybe when I graduate, I maybe go to a SME company. So women are facing some difficulties like exposed to problems to have access to capital and markets. So like less than 1% of money are reached to these women-owned enterprises. So these women-owned enterprises are facing great challenges in their finance, in their economic sectors. And also there the credit gap between the women and men are big in some developing countries. So like the women-owned enterprises are 1/3 more likely to get the loan application rejected than the men-owned enterprises. And another factor is that we can see the enterprises nowadays are relied on the digital technology. But according to the research that women have poor ability to access and use and also to afford these digital tools. So no matter in the enterprises or in the daily life that we can see it's a great challenge for women to more engage in our society and also in the development of the whole world. And the last point is that I think nowadays in some small and medium enterprises, women lack skills and capacity building. So compared with these big business that they may provide some trainings and the skill developing activities, in these SMEs, women lack these trainings and capacity buildings. So if they want to like promote themselves, maybe they have to attend classes, lessons, workshops after their work. So which may left them a great burden on finance and also reduce their time with their family and also their time to rest. So I think nowadays when we're talking about leadership, it's quite important to face some challenges and the variants we are faced with. So I also hope that in the future we can like find solutions to these questions, problems, and to promote and empower women together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Xiaoshen. Two things about your comments. First, you talk about leadership style, a more collaborative, horizontal leadership style. You are right, less command and control. And I think that's important, to combine different leadership styles, and that's why it's critical to have the 50% of the population who we represent really leading in many ways. And the second thing you mentioned is the SMEs and how important they are for women. And you are totally right. Not only they are important for women, they are also important for the economy of the world. So that's central. You also said something that I believe is important for our Generation Equality Forum, but also for the post-pandemic efforts to revitalize the economy. And that is to include a gender lens in the implementation of new measures to have the right training, the right skills to prepare women to lead in the way they should lead. Sir Young, let me now go to you, please.
Thank you for Susana Malcorra for inviting me and the other participants for this prominent event. I'd like to define leadership as determined magnanimity or tolerance. Whenever I was faced with new people in extracurricular activities, such as model UN conferences or any seminar or extra, I witnessed some masculine leadership, which I should reject. And in that case, the majority rule and authoritative culture takes place so that there are the minority or any person who are a bit excluded from the decision-making process. For me, defining the leadership paradigm is closely related to the role model that I should cling on to. When we think of the leadership paradigm, something awkward happens. I think most South Koreans neglect the possibility of a determined but also soft leader as a chief of their workplace or team. However, to empower women to take leadership roles, I think there is the necessity to foster defining a new leadership paradigm, which means a leader with powerful capabilities, of course, to handle difficult workplace conflicts with soft personality. Since I hope to serve the diplomatic services of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would like to address the case of soft leadership in executive positions. Kang Kyung-hwa, who was the former Minister of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of South Korea, is the one that I must mention. Her leadership has been challenged in the sense that she wasn't the one who passed the entrance exam to be a diplomat in South Korea, and the point that her career in the United Nations is not concentrated with traditional security issues. I remember her impressive quote that the United Nations is the battlefield without gunshots. I remember this because this was her answer to the lawmakers in the hearing. And every time when she had to break through such prejudices, her attitudes impressed the people who were not even favorable to her at all. The way she addressed the controversial issues in the National Assembly for hearing, as I mentioned, was not just adequate, but also powerful and succeeded in not offending any lawmaker. And she became the minister. So she also addressed the South Korea's role to soothe the leadership between North Korea and South Korea, and promoted the South Korea's policies of protection in COVID-19, and as well as the warning for any racial discrimination due to the COVID-19 crisis. And moreover, what I respect her is that she also covered her staff from the security advisor from the Blue House when the staff made mistakes in order to encourage her staffs to overcome mistakes which were already made. To be honest, I was the one doubting her power. I mean, not the strength or capability, but her leadership power, since her image was so soft. But I realized that the masculine leadership is not the one that I should pursue, and I could come up with the idea that I should empower other women besides me to step forward with their own leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Young, and I really appreciate your bringing your former foreign minister, Kyung-hwa, as an example. I know her well. I've worked very closely with her, and she's just like you described, a very powerful woman with soft power, which is often the less likely way to see power, but is the most effective one. So I congratulate you in that regard. Let me now go to Uyiswa and ask you, how do you see this issue?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the panel. And thank you so much to the other ladies for their insightful opinions so far. I think I really agree with many of the points that have been made. I think for me, the shift in the leadership paradigm is the fact that you don't need to have a title in order to lead. If you have personal agency, you can be considered a leader. So I just want to give an example of something that happened here in South Africa a few years ago. So we had high school students, female high school students, who are attending a formerly only white high school. And after democracy, it became called a Model C school where all the different races can attend. So they're attending the school. However, the code of conduct in terms of the uniform does not necessarily align or allow women to, or these young African women to actually have their afros out. It's considered untidy. So now you have these women who are in grade 9, grade 10, in grade 11, really not agreeing with the situation in terms of the dynamics. And what did they do? They stood up and they had their voices heard and they protested against the code of conduct. Some of them were suspended, but what happened is that they actually created awareness of a cause that, I mean, I went through when I was in high school as well, and many of us went through, but they much younger than me, but they were able to actually have individual concerns. So personal agency, individual agency, and work together and collaborate together and actually come and have collective agency and have their voices heard, to the extent that, South Africa supported them socially in social media. They got quite a big support, as well as the Minister of Education for that province and the school governing body came together to actually relook at the code of conduct. So for me, I think the shift here is the fact that, young women have personal agency, and because of that personal agency, they're able to identify the issues that really concern them and come together collectively and actually have their voices heard. So they don't need to, they're not part of a formal structure. They're not leading because they have titles, but they're actually leading because they have concerns and things that they want to stand up for. And because they can collectively come together and gain the mass, the critical mass, I think, because you need critical mass to kind of make a difference and to actually be heard. So I think because of that critical mass then that they can actually gain by coming together, they're able to actually then influence and demand change from people that actually can make the changes. So I think for me, that's that shift in the leadership paradigm. The fact that, you don't have to lead with the title, the fact that you don't have to have a big name behind you, but the fact that if you can stand up for what you care about, gain critical mass, collaborate with others, then you actually can make a change. And the definition of leadership is that leadership is the ability to influence others, or the ability of a group to influence others. And I think with personal agency, if you come as authentically yourself, you're able to actually lead. And I mean, I look at the other ladies on the panel, and by just actually voicing out their own opinions and actually giving their own views, you actually are leading, you actually are having some influence. And I think for me, that's like the biggest paradigm shift, that you don't have to be in a structured kind of system to make a difference.
That is a great approach, so clearly authority, power can be conferred or can be acquired by your own sense of duty, your own sense of what is important, what the principles are that you should defend. The example you gave is exactly that, and that's what we need. And that's why we are here. That's why you are speaking, because you are the power of today, but most importantly, the power of the future, coming from all corners of the world. So let's go now to a second round of questions. And let me ask you now, how can we deal with underrepresentation of women in leadership roles from your perspective? This is a very, very important question, because it is said that when you are underrepresented, your capacity, your ability to influence and to make changes, to enact changes, is reduced. So let me start now with Xiaoyang and have you answer this question first. Over to you.
Thank you, Susana, Malcorra. I think the paradigm shift of leadership must be preceded because in South Korea, countless women reject the executive position or any leadership role, since those decisions may undermine their current position, as I think. So any woman who is designated to the leadership role can be target of the massive backlashes, and the outcome would turn out to be the derogation of her previous career. In this sense, I recall the recent interview of Yoon Yo-sun, who were the first executive in the LG. It is one of the conglomerate like Samsung in South Korea, that she was encountered with a rude male counterpart when she were in the golf course only accessible by executives. One man ordered her to bring the golf ball, so she did it, but with a very calm voice. She warned him that self-service is the rule at the place. And then another man come came up to her and whispered her that nice shot, which was the sincere recognition that her reaction was sensible and humorous. And since this is the personal example to how to deal with the underrepresented problem, for underrepresentation-wise, I think South Korean women should pay attention to the current women leaders in the National Assembly. There are some leaders in the National Assembly, and there are like 2 lawmakers which making progresses. And one was backlashed by her dress, because she wear dress in the National Assembly, whether to wear a suit. But I think this kind of paradigm shift, this kind of the image changes are important to bring women to the leadership roles, and especially in National Assembly, because not many women think in South Korea think that they cannot work in the National Assembly because it is dominated by the male lawmakers. But because of the 2 lawmakers, we can think of that, okay, I can work with the other male lawmakers, even if I am wearing any dress or any outfit, and excluding the suit. And those kind of breaking the prejudices and cooperation with the other women in the National Assembly would encourage women to make their mind to challenge the backlashes in the National Assembly and also in the executive positions. Thank you.
Thank you. Boyiswa, let me go to you now.
Okay, thank you. For me, when I think of the underrepresentation of women, there are 4 things that come to mind in terms of how do we address it, or rather, what are the possible causes for that? So South Africa is a very racially and culturally kind of like a melting pot of different cultures and of different races, they different sexes, they're different ages. So all those things actually count when you look at leadership. And so for me, I think intersectionality and diversity are actually very important when you are trying to address or advance women's leadership in whether it's the private sector or whether it's in government. So you need kind of policies or interventions, whether private or public, that actually look and address like the differences and also the fact that as a person, as a leader, you're influenced by many things and you engage with the world because of those influences. So I think that's the one thing that we actually need to consider. And we have the Employment Equity Act here in South Africa. And it actually looks at employment across different occupational levels. So from your top management all the way through to your, your shop floor. And what it's actually found out is that if you actually look at the data in terms of men and women, you can see that women haven't really been advancing that much. I think about like 24% of women are in management positions in the manufacturing sector, because that's what I've been looking at. But it's actually just basically generally the same across all the other sectors. But then when you slice up the data a bit more and then you kind of put race into it, then you can kind of see the dynamics, because we have different races. We've got your whites, you've got your blacks, and your blacks, they're not divided into colored, Indian, and Africans. So then when you start dividing that, then you can kind of see which women are in which leadership positions. And then you kind of start asking yourself, why is this the case? And it could be the case for multiple reasons. But the fact that we are all different and we all have different aspects of our identity that actually influence how we lead and how we actually gain leadership, I think that's very important to take into account. The other aspect for me, which is very, very important, is the fact that data shows, and I think it's also been mentioned here, that men actually are, they're the gatekeepers, I think, I can put it that way, that they're the gatekeepers of these leadership positions. They dominate these leadership positions in these strategic decision-making roles. And, gender is a socially constructed kind of idea. It comes with it with systemic kind of stereotypes, biases that men hold. So we kind of need to ask ourselves, if men are the ones that are actually, making the decisions, then they're the ones that are actually also excluding women. So what do we do to actually bring them into the conversation? What do we do to kind of make them align with women, so that it's not just a woman's fight for women, but it's actually a human being fight, I guess I could say it that way, for women. It's not just, you know, one-sided. And I think a lot of the pressure has been put on women. I mean, we have a women panelist only here. There's no males that have been invited to speak. I'm not sure how many males are actually part of this webinar right now that have joined us, but you have the situation where it's always been like, it's a woman's fight, it's a woman's agenda, so women should be like at the forefront. But men are actually the ones that, through their own conscious or unconscious bias, are actually, you know, holding women back to a certain extent, and they need to kind of be checked in a way. They need to check their biases. They need to kind of be called they need to be made accountable for their biases. And the only way that can happen is if they're actually drawn into the conversation. And another thing for me, the third one, is the fact that as women, we also live in a society that has kind of groomed us to be a certain way, that's groomed us to think a certain way. Be polite, don't be loud, you know, don't be too aggressive. And all of these things actually impact you as a person when you start going into different spaces. So I know for me personally, you know, I culturally, you don't speak up to your elders. Culturally, you don't call your elders by their first names. There's so many different cultural things that have actually influenced me. So when I was working, I couldn't, you know, I was very, I guess I would come across as timid, but that's just not necessarily because I don't want to take up the challenges. It's not because I don't want to speak out, but it's because of the things that have influenced me culturally. So I think as women, we also need to kind of maybe gain some kind of program or gain some kind of guidance and leadership that can help us kind of, you know, gain some confidence and be able to speak up and be able not to lead like men, but lead like ourselves, but be seen, you know, and just have that confidence. And I think the last one, which is I think something that was mentioned, is the fact that we need women-centric kind of policies. We need to actually take women's accounts into account. We need to have policies. If you look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, majority of trade in Africa is informal trade. Informal trade is done by women. Cross-border informal trade is done by women. But then you have a formal policy which requires women to actually have formal structures in place, but informal trade is not formal. They don't have, you know, necessarily bank accounts and, you know, the right documentation. So you have that type of situation where you actually need now, you don't necessarily need to, I don't think you need to necessarily have the women like in the leadership positions, but their voices need to be represented. So research needs to be done that actually unpacks what the specific like issues are for women and actually integrate those into policy. And I mean, it's much better if women are in the actual, you know, decision making and in the actual policy making aspect. But if that can't be done, then I think, you know, they need to actually really think about how they can integrate women's voices and actually represent women's needs and not just put women at a more disadvantage because they already have less resources and formal resources to start with. So.
Thank you, Yiswa. Here is clear that is sort of a catch-22, you know, the dog biting its tail. How do we do it? And unless you get enough into power, it's hard to have enough influence in policy making. And there, you know, there is this point that Seo-Yeon made about taking things in your own hand in a way. And the other aspect is having positive agendas, positive policies that enact and oblige the system to change, you know, and quotas is one aspect. You know, when I was young your age, I thought that only merit and my own doing will do it. I then learned that that's necessary, but it's not enough. And that a certain level of objectives set by law help move ahead. Let me go now to Seo-Yeon, please.
Okay, thank you. So what Yulisa said, really like, I really agree with her. And she mentioned that some of movements, they're only women's fight, but actually I like to share a story from China that we engage also males participation in our women's issues. So like there is a movement called Stop Period Shaming. And in last year that in China, the university students started to set up some mutual aid boxes with the free pads inside it, and we set it in the bathrooms and also classrooms, and almost every university followed this movement, and also a lot of enterprises also attend this event, and we got a lot of supports. And really moved me is that at our campus, that our male teachers, male students also engage in this movement. So we would like to say that stop period shaming. So I think it's very important. The first step is that we should set up confidence in ourselves. So no matter it's mentally or physically, that we should not look down ourselves because our gender. So we should have this good attitudes for ourselves, I think. And from another perspective, for me, I think education is the most important factor that really influence the leadership. So I believe the knowledge is the power. So I think nowadays and at our universities, and also other schools, we should need the government and organizations to give more supports. For example, that it's very important to narrow the gender gap in education. So I found that in some countries, they will have some universities, they would reject female applicants in favor of less qualified male applicants. I think these situations should be avoided. And another point is that I think women should, the participation of women in STEM fields should be increased. As we know that development of our countries and also the society is closely related to the technology, the STEM fields. So and also women are largely underrepresented in these fields. And also a lot of stereotypes that women could not do well in this area. And even I remember when I was in my young age, my parents just told me, oh, do not to learn math, it's too difficult for you. So I think in order to reduce the sexism, I believe the governments and organizations should give more supports. For example, they could set up some STEM workshops for girls, for young women to attend. And in these workshops, maybe women can learn much more about these knowledges ahead of time before they enter the university, and to communicate with the professors. So they can be more interested or get more information about this area. So in this way, maybe in the future, more women may be engaged in this area. And the last point I think is very important as we are doing now is that we can have more activities, more events on the gender issues, the gender equality issues. So many people, they don't realize the barriers and the circumstances of the gender equality. So I think it's very important to have some lessons at schools, and also the dialogues we are having now throughout the world. So to engage more young people or other peoples in different fields, in various fields, to engage in this dialogue and to have further discussion and to give their suggestions. And also during this process, they can know much more about this issue. I think this can promote the gender equality and also women's leadership very well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Susana. I am an engineer, I have to say, and I was the only one in my class forever, and I was the only one in my work at the initial phases in my work. So I know exactly what you're talking about regarding STEM, and you're totally right. Now let me go to Sam to close this round of questions.
Thank you, Ms. Malcorra. I appreciate a lot that's been said on this issue, and there's a lot to be spoken about in regard to this issue. And as someone who's passionate about policy and reproductive justice, and the intersection of all of these, I think there's a need to firstly recognize the social limitations and gaps that come with existing policy, and what these limitations mean for underrepresentation of women in leadership positions, and how some of these policy frameworks continue to underpin women's exclusion from the question of leadership or change. And so in my experience, a lot of the existing policy frameworks fail to center the needs and experiences of vulnerable groups. And even when the legal and policy instruments are in place, even when they are women-centric, as Visa has just spoken about, we have to ask questions such as, which women are they centering? Are they still upholding dominant narratives? Are they taking issues such as class, disability, womanhood, sexuality into account? Or do they continue to center elitist or a particular class of women who aren't the direct victims of certain injustices, or women who have access to certain resources that other women do not. So what I realized in my experience, I recently, 2 years ago, co-authored a sexual education curriculum, and this forced me to do research on what are the existing sexual and reproductive health policies in my country and on the continent. And something I realized was that it focused on mostly heteronormative frameworks and women who are straight, and perhaps women who are middle and upper class who have access to certain resources, but women who are refugees, women who live with HIV and AIDS, women who have disabilities, women who live in rural areas who don't have access to resources, are rarely ever centered in the construction of these policies. So, for example, I like what Lucy said earlier about capacity building and institution building and developing a gender lens when thinking of these trainings and mentorship for women. But if a decision is made to expose more young women to educational opportunities, how does this play out in countries where policy dissemination and implementation is a challenge? And particularly when the policy is targeted at improving or reforming an issue such as gender parity that is culturally looked down upon, has been and continues to be looked down upon. So I like what Visa said about intersectionality and this hyper-awareness of the context in which these issues are being dealt with, the demographic challenges that this particular area or region is dealing with, and how these policies can reach the most marginalized of groups, how they can uplift the most disenfranchised communities. And once you start from this point, it becomes easier to account for the different experiences, the variance of experiences that, you know, the different women that we're trying to target and reach out to experience.
Thank you, Sam. It's an enriching perspective, and you can see the different views coming from all corners of the world that have nuances, that have the local, cultural, historic characteristics, but at the same time have so much in common. And that's what is the richness of this exchange today. Listening. Listen, we have now reached the third and last question, but I will have to ask you to be a little bit briefer because we are running out of time. So if you can summarize your answer in 2.5 minutes, that will be very important. And the question is the association of women leadership, and women's participation in the COVID environment. How do you see, or do you see any gender perspective in leadership in the way women participated in order to impact positively the handling of the COVID impact? So let me start now with Xiaoshen. Please, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So on this topic, I think I may have a very different view from others. Since that China controlled the COVID-19 very quickly, I see the women's power and the women's strengths during this process. So as most of the nurses, actually, most of them are women, and they show their responsibilities and braveness and perseverance that they have to wear the protective clothing for a very long time. But they are just facing these difficulties, and they have great love for their country and also their jobs. So a lot of stereotypes about women, I think, are fading away during the COVID-19. And also I see the strong leadership in the medical area during the COVID. So in China, there are more than 2 leading figures, and we can say there are models for the women to gain leaderships, to empowerment. So one is called Li Lanjuan. So she is very important leader that she like to serve as an important member and to prevent the this COVID-19 in various regions. And also another woman called Chen Wei, she invented the casino COVID-19 vaccine. So they made great contributions during the COVID. I think we can see that women's talents, responsibility, and the leadership in many different areas. And also, I see some new opportunities for women in the future after the COVID-19. As we know that during the COVID-19, so many works and jobs are moved to online. So many companies apply the AI interview technology. So the gender biases are decreased. And the second is that the online work mode actually reduced the sexual harassment in the workplace. So women are more protected than before. And the third one is that women are more easily to balance their work and the family, which is a great dilemma to women. So then they may better pursue their career. I think this model that combine the offline and online in the future maybe will be a better work mode for the women. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshan. You made a very, very good point regarding the fact that at the front line of fighting COVID in the health system were essentially women. And this is not only in China, this is throughout the world. And this is something that is fundamental, not only at the leadership level, but at the working level, how we have been able to represent the center force against COVID. Let me go now to Seo Young, please.
I would like to point out one role model who emerged with the COVID-19 era and my personal experience. The role model that I would like to address is Zhang Engyang, and she is the current chief of the KCDA, which is the chief institution for handling COVID-19. I think she addressed how to bounce back from failure and take full responsibility as the chief of one organization. After MERS in South Korea, she was punished by the government, even though it wasn't her fault since the equipped test kits were insufficient and the guidelines weren't set enough. However, she didn't abandon the position like the male executives. Instead, she restructured the reacting processes when the pandemic hits the peninsula, and her efforts for complete preparation led her to hold the conferences before the pandemic hit South Korea. This was the critical issue because the conference was held like 10 days earlier before the COVID-19 hits the peninsula, and it was scheduled like 1 year ahead. So this was impressive, and to me and the other women. And since the organization was fully ready, South Korea handled the situation successfully compared to the MERS in 2015. And her sincerity had reached to the young generation. She held a conference accepting the questions from the children, which was excluded from this kind of information sharing, and letting them know how to deal with COVID-19 on a daily basis, like how to deal with the COVID-19, even if a child was her birthday, kind of. So this kind of receptivity wasn't seen in the other male leaders, and this impressed other women leaders a lot. And personally, as a youth, several young women tend to focus on their careers and sustainable budget planning in order to maintain the quality of life, even if there is unprecedented uncertainty in the labor market. So thousands of women chose to cooperate with other women, accelerating their previous experiences and sharing their knowledges. And the IMF crisis, it was the 1997, and we call it IMF crisis, but actually it is the foreign exchange shortage. And there was also the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007. And those experiences shared with women and between the women was so important because there was no any kind of cooperation before the COVID-19, and many women can cooperate with this issue, with the economic issue. So I think this kind of solidarity between women to help themselves with their community changed the women how to deal with COVID-19, and also this is the critical change after the COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoyon. Empathy is something that is central to handling this crisis. And you describe that clearly in the example of the leader that you spoke about. Buiswa, over to you.
Thank you. So for me, what came across a lot was the fact that once again, women are excluded from decision making in terms of the response to COVID-19. So you have, like it was said, the frontline workers, essential workers, so your nurses, even your shop handlers, and because I mean shops were kept open, so it's not just your technical like essential workers, but your hospitality, your restaurants. Those women were actually at the forefront before lockdown, and during lockdown they're the ones that were mostly affected, but they were not part of the decision making. They were not necessarily considered fully. I mean, in South Africa we had nurses without PPE for quite a long time, and they were putting themselves and their families in danger. So for me, it goes back to what I spoke about earlier in terms of personal agency and collective agency, because even though women were not necessarily in the decision-making structures, the formal structures, you had women leaders in community grassroots organizations. You had traditional leaders in terms of, I'm from KwaZulu-Natal, so we have traditional leaders in the rural areas, and they were the ones that were communicating the fact that you need to sanitize, you need to wear masks, and they would be the liaisons between your mobile clinics and the community, and actually sharing information with the community. So I think once again, it's actually shown how women are flexible, how they can adapt, and how they can actually work together. We've got something here in South Africa called Ubuntu, and it's actually, I think, also very African concepts and ideology, whereby you help the community. You have, directly translated, Ubuntu just means like being a person of the community and actually helping and uplifting the community. And that's what these women leaders have done in here in South Africa, in terms of they're not leading necessarily with titles, they're not necessarily in the decision-making structures, but they are actually leading by taking action and actually, and actually encouraging collaboration. And I mean, I think it might be known that in South Africa, we've got gender-based violence, and it's really bad. And we've got femicide, and it's 5 times larger than the rest of the world. And that was before the global pandemic. And you had women leaders actually rallying up and actually helping, people on the ground and families on the ground, in terms of women that are actually that since lockdown have been greatly affected in terms of gender-based violence. So for me, once again, just it's the idea of the fact that, women they're adaptable, they are flexible, and they can actually take things into their own hands. And I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of the presidents and how COVID response by women presidents around the world, from New Zealand and Germany, have been such great examples. But I think what hasn't been spoken about is the grassroots communities, community-based organizations that have actually really interfaced with the community and actually very close with the community, and how important their role has been. And I think moving forward, those organizations and those types of leaders need to be assisted more, upskilled more, and given more kind of support in terms of leading communities and being able to actually bring everyone together in terms of a response that is inclusive.
Thank you, Yisa. Sam, you have the last word here.
Thank you. And just to tie what everyone has said together, I was recently thinking of, there's been a lot of talk about the women leaders who've been involved in, spearheading the COVID crisis, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Germany, and less has been said about the leaders on the continent, and Visa has spoken about the grassroots women leaders who are rarely spoken of. But also we have the Prime Minister of Namibia, who has been lauded for her efforts in, combating the crisis. And I think at a point Namibia had recorded 39 cases when, the cases were flying high across the world. So while there is a focus on, Western models of leadership, I think there also is a need to take into account even leadership models from the global South, from Latin America, from the continent, because there are women leaders in these positions who are also doing their part in spearheading the crisis. And I think the reality is that the countries led by women are faring better during COVID, not only because these countries are led by women, but because the election and selection of female leaders is indicative of a more equitable society where the qualities that these female leaders bring onto the table are valued and appreciated. And so for far too long, the leadership styles, particularly on the African continent, have been autocratic, dictatorship, totalitarian, invulnerable, stoic. That's the leadership style that we are predisposed to seeing and accustomed to seeing a lot. And what we have seen and we continue to see the impacts of this because we continue to be led by these particular kind of leaders. But what the current crisis is showing us is that perhaps it's time to embrace both male and female leaders, as Visa mentioned earlier, who exhibit and embrace this different traits that we're seeing: the vulnerability, the empathy, the ability to remain proximate to the grassroots communities that you are eventually serving, despite being kind of detached from them. And these leaders who embrace these qualities, regardless of what these qualities connote, and these leaders who can utilize their capacities to listen to the people they're serving, to the experts, who can be assertive yet compassionate at the same time, who are able to utilize this and draw all of this together and pivot this into policy implementation and save lives during a crisis. So in order to do this, I think we just need to embrace all qualities across the board from both men and women and see how this can best come together in an amalgamation of qualities that can end up serving the people that need it the most.
Thank you to the four of you. I mean, this has been an amazing journey. Just listening to you gives me this notion that the world has a better future. Having women coming from the African continent, from Asia, telling stories that are enlightening, that allow us to understand better leadership styles, how cultural influence makes a difference, but at the same time, there is so much commonality on the issues that you bring together. So it makes me be more convinced than ever that these intergenerational dialogues should continue. They will go beyond the Generation Equality Forum. We will continue to reach out to you, to your fellow students, to more universities, but more importantly, we need to make the case for this new leadership approach in the 21st century that will really be impactful. And as you said, it's not necessarily a matter of men and women or women, it's a matter of all of us coming together. The point is that men are the ones that are holding power today, essentially. So we need to persuade them to let go part of that power and allow all of us to have our fair share to positively influence policy design and policy making, so future generations will have it a little bit easier in this regard. So I thank you. I thank you for the opportunity to listen to you, to hear your voices, to get your wisdom. And I only promise that I will pass it on to my colleagues, but also hope that the large audience that will be listening to this today, that has listened today or will be listening in the future days, will really, really appreciate how much understanding and depth you have brought to the conversation. Thanks very much.